So today we are very privileged to have Todd Stern with us on an interview for Earth.org, who has been the U.S. climate envoy, um, in particular for the historic Paris Agreement. And we are very excited about this because this is something that I think Earth.org has never had before, is an interview with someone of your caliber. And it's in connection with your new book. Now, may I start out by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself and the book that you've just published, which I believe was just published a few days ago. And
Yeah,
what's your background? How did this come about?
sure. Well, my I background is originally as a lawyer, and I sort of swerved into the political world back in actually in the 1988 presidential campaign, and have been mostly doing the kind of an intersection of policy and politics for a long time since then. I worked in for President Clinton in the White House and had a completely different job, but in around July of 1997, I was asked to jump in and help on the preparation for the Kyoto conference later that year. And mostly, I haven't gotten away from climate change since then. I didn't have any particular background in it then, but the powers that be were looking for an additional kind of senior person to help on that, and so I was at the COP and in the process of preparation for those two for 1997, 1998, and 97. I didn't know a lot. I was learning. Um, then I kept my hand in on climate in the interregnum for Democrats between President Clinton and President Obama, and then I came into the administration with President Obama as the special envoy for climate change. So I was there from the beginning in January 2009 until the middle of 2016, which takes us through all the 7 years on the road to Paris, which my book focuses on.
Now, your book, Landing the Paris Agreement, is on its surface, it's about, well, specifically the Paris Agreement, but it starts quite a bit before then.
Yes.
Why did you decide to talk about the time prior to that rather than focusing on the negotiations for the Paris Agreement itself?
Because I saw it very much as as the road to Paris being that entire 7 year period from the time that the Obama administration started and that I came in until the Paris Agreement actually got finished. And I do see it that way. I think that all of the COPs that in effect led up to Paris, although we didn't obviously know that when we were starting out, are all quite relevant to what happened, very much including the first one in Copenhagen.
That's very much the impression I got from reading the book, as well as that each stage built on the last. And I'd say that's probably the strength of the book from what I saw the most, more than anything else, is that it gives you a big picture feeling for where did this come from. That's something I appreciated very much. Um,
Good. That was my intention.
Now, one of the questions I really had was who is the book for? Now, the readers of Earth.org they tend to be people who are interested in the climate and environmental topics. But when you wrote this book, did you have a reader in mind? And who is that reader?
I had two readers in mind. I had, I always sort of tried to keep myself on what I sort of thought metaphorically of as a balance beam between writing a book that people who are uh, professionals with respect to climate change, or at least quite engaged, and that doesn't just include government people, that includes press and business and NGOs and people like the people who read Earth.org, it would be interesting enough and in depth enough to be interesting to them, while at the same time being kind of straightforward enough without a lot of jargon and written at a high enough level that people who walk into their local bookstore and are just interested in climate change and interested in the international aspect of climate change might want to buy it. So I tried to be on that balance beam that would be attractive to both, and I'm sure I haven't done it exactly right, but that was my intention.
And what will you expect someone to do after they've read this book? What do you want them to feel? Do you think that they should be angry about, for example, the United States being a little bit, in and out of the Paris Agreement, or should they be hopeful for the future?
Well, I think that they should be that they should understand the the climate challenge more. That they should understand that it very much has two sides of it. One is the actions that countries need to take. It probably has a lot more than two sides, but at least two sides. The actions that countries need to take at a domestic level, but also the fact that you have to operate at the international level for a problem like climate change, which is so quintessentially universal
It's
and
by
so
definition global.
yeah, exactly. So it's important if you want to have a sense of where we are at with climate change and what's important to do. It's important to understand the international side as well. So I basically wanted to do both of those things.
Talking about the international relations, your, I would say, particular relationship, if I can call that, with your Chinese counterpart was something that really it came out throughout the book that this was a very special relationship, not always a positive one, sometimes very combative. Can you tell our readers, those who haven't read the book yet, tell us about that relationship? How did it start? How did it develop over time?
Yeah, so my counterpart was Xie Zhenhua, and he was the Chinese lead on climate change. Actually, for him on both the domestic and the international side, and a Chinese leader of substantial influence and clout. I liked him right away. I think we liked each other right away. We met in March of 2009, and I said to him at that time, actually, sort of interestingly, that I thought that the U.S. and China, that he and I could try to make climate change a positive element, positive pillar, I think is the word I used in our relationship, which was quite fraught even then, not as strained as it is now, but still difficult. Most every issue that was relevant with respect to the U.S. and China was an issue of tension. And it's not that I thought climate change was ever going to be easy, but I thought we could work together, and that actually ended up happening. And I think partly, I mean, he's a quite in his own way, quite charismatic guy, and very expressive and funny and tough, and just like to me, a great counterpart. And um, so we started to work together. That the first year, I think we did not actually. U.S. China, I don't think made lots of progress other than a setting a certain standard that I think they didn't want to continue. In other words, they wanted to not go through the same thing that from a substantive standpoint that we went through in 2009. But the relationship was good and getting better. And if I can share one sort of funny little story that happened from that year, just as an illustration of the relationship, I'll do that. So we're getting together in September, early September of 2009, and we've talked a lot already that year. And there's real tensions between where we stood and where they stood. So we're in Washington. We're standing around in the windowless conference room, which was the place that that I and my team spent most of our time. And we haven't even sat down yet. We're just sort of chatting. And so I tell them this story, which is a true story, which was that not that long ago, some weeks earlier, my wife and I had been driving in Washington, just in Maryland, just close to Washington, with two of our three sons, one of whom was 9, and one of whom was Zachary, and one of whom was 4 years old then. And the two of them were in the back seat arguing about where we were going to have lunch. And Zachary really wanted to go to a place called Panera Bread. So and he's pushing and pushing and pushing, and Ben won't give an inch. The 4-year-old won't give an inch. And finally, Zachary says, "Okay, okay, okay, we won't go to Panera Bread, but then I get to choose dinner." And Ben looks at him totally, totally straight and says, "Well, I agree with you about lunch, but I don't agree about dinner." And, and so I said to my wife, "He's been getting lessons from Minister Shia." So that's all of that happened exactly as I just said. So I told that to Shia, and he just burst out laughing. He's all red in the face, which happens when he either gets where he either laughs a lot or gets angry, one or the other. And his whole team is laughing. And Shia actually said, "No, no, 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 no. He's learning from his daddy." Uh,
Ah,
and
very good.
and so it's a funny story, but it's also the kind of story that indicates already a certain closeness in terms of the friendship. And that continued. I think that the Chinese, I mean, my own view is the Chinese came out of the Copenhagen experience feeling that a couple of things had not gone well for them. One is that they found themselves, because of certain positions they took, at crosshairs with the poor and vulnerable countries, which they really didn't want to
Mm.
do. And I think that they found, I think that they did not want to be in kind of open, um, antagonism, public antagonism with the United States the way they were. And so they didn't, it's not that they radically changed their positions right away, but I think from that time on, there was more of an effort to, let's try to work things out. Let's at least not argue in the press and all of that.
I mean, the Copenhagen situation, I almost want to call it, was in a certain sense the most entertaining part of the book because it was going so terribly. I mean, the Venezuelan representative, slashing her hand to show the blood, and the
Yeah.
Rasmussen throwing up, hands and saying, "Oh, I can't deal." Tell our readers how that went.
Well, Copenhagen was, without doubt, the most chaotic, dramatic, kind of mind-bending COP, Conference of the Parties, that there has ever been. And Copenhagen is generally, even to this day, dismissed as a kind of a miserable failure. I have always had a different view about that. It was all of those things that I just said, chaotic and mind-bending and a mess in a whole variety of ways. But some very important things happened in that Copenhagen Accord, which was reached at really the last minute, by initially a group of about 25 leaders, developed and developing countries, that the Danes finally managed to pull together on Thursday night, so 24 hours before the thing's supposed to be. The Danes had been trying to pull together a group like that, not at the leader level, because the leaders didn't come till the end, practically for the whole conference, but were blocked in doing so. The conference had sort of started, I think maybe the second day of the conference, with a very overblown leak of a supposedly secret document that the Danes were doing behind closed doors, which were going to tilt the whole exercise against developing countries in favor of developed. That was a gross exaggeration, and indeed, a week before the conference started, there had been a meeting of about 30 or so people at my level of developed and developing countries discussing all of this specific document that was leaked. In any event, the point is that the leak definitely poisoned the waters, and it was very difficult for the Danes to manage to do much of anything in terms of really driving toward a conclusion. The leaders then come. It was the first time leaders had ever been invited to work. The COPs had always happened at the ministerial level, or or below that, but never with leaders and the Danes. I think understanding the kind of agreement that at that point they were trying to encourage would never happen without leaders. It would involve the kind of changes that people under that level wouldn't agree to. So there was a reason for doing that. It was also highly risky, and it contributed to the whole kind of gestalt of the Copenhagen Accord. At the end of the day, an agreement was reached in that group of 30 or so. It included a quite dramatic bit toward the end where President Obama and Secretary Clinton and a few others of us found where the Chinese leader was, because President Obama there was
the great party crash of Copenhagen.
Yeah. It was quite an extraordinary event, and it's actually a photo from that is what's on the cover of the book.
Oh, really? That's the fateful moment.
That's the famous meeting.
Oh, right.
And the president wanted to find Premier Wen Jiabao in order to because he knew we weren't going to be able to get over the hurdle of these last 2 points. And in fact, found Wen Jiabao along with the presidents of India, South Africa, and Brazil. That fateful meeting happened. It was brought then things wrapped back up in the room where the 30 leaders were. But it's still and there was an agreement there in that space. But the thing still had to get approved by the full plenary, the full all 195 or so countries. One of the aspects of climate change negotiations that's so especially challenging is that the basic understanding of how decisions are made is by consensus. So you have to have all or virtually all countries agreeing, and that didn't happen then. And you probably had all but about 15 countries that were ready to say okay, but then there was sort of a revolt, and that was another dramatic moment. So yes, there was a lot of drama in Copenhagen, but it was the elements of Copenhagen there were new elements of Copenhagen that in essence started to pave the way for Paris. So it's very much, it is both a dramatic story to tell, but is very much part of the story leading to Paris.
I'm going to skip over Cancun because to a certain extent that went well as far as I could read from your book. And if I can apologize a little bit, that was kind of the dullest part because everybody, a lot of people were agreeing with each other. But the moment
I will say, I agree with you. I would just say one thing though, which was the purpose of Cancun, as we saw it, was to basically bring the substance that had been agreed to in Copenhagen into an agreement that would in fact be officially adopted by the conference. And so it basically takes the 2.5 pages, expands them to about 30, but it's really all that content, and that then gets adopted. So then the substance of Copenhagen embellished was then adopted. And that was actually quite important also. And not the most exciting, but that was important.
To me, the moment when I kind of felt an emotional change in your book was the moment you were sitting in the office of John Kerry, who I'm interested to note has a fireplace in his office, and agreed to have that first bilateral meeting with China. Can you tell me how that went?
Well, yeah. So well, it wasn't his first bilateral meeting with China,
Mm,
but that had happened in 2013 because that's when he started, and
mm,
this is going to feed into your question, but he was interested in China and saw China's importance right away when he came in
mm,
2013, and he wanted to go to China quite early in April and prepare a strong statement about the importance of climate change that
mm,
he and his counterpart would agree to there, and that's something that I negotiated with a lot of input
mm,
from Secretary Kerry, but negotiated with Minister Xia. Kerry then went to China. They did the statement. They also agreed to set up a U.S.-China climate change working group to focus on
mm,
technical stuff,
mm.
on various kinds of technology,
Right.
not as a negotiating the
Hmm.
agreement, something different to sort of get the two countries to work
Hmm.
together, which actually is useful. Same year, and not all that much longer, maybe early June or late, I think early June, President Obama met with President Xi for the first time at a place called SternㅅLanding in Southern California. And that was a meeting that the White House did not where the White House did not have in mind a lot of what in the government people tend to call deliverables. So they agree on this
Hmm.
statement, that thing, whatever. But there was one small thing that was covered, which was a climate change issue having to do with reducing a small but still problematic industrial gas, often referred to as HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, but
Right.
HFCs. And the idea that was actually kicking around for a while, driven by a very good a guy named Dan Reefsnyder on the State Department environmental team, which was to try to reduce the HFCs through the means of the Montreal Protocol, completely different
Right.
organization. Montreal Protocol deals with
Or it's
the ozone layer,
focused on
and
CFCs.
exactly, and was really one of the most successful international environmental agreements ever. It actually worked, and um, and it was a much less politically charged,
Mm.
kind of difficult, acrimonious organization than the climate, the
To be,
UNFCCC, which is the
to be
climate
fair, a
body.
much
So
simpler topic.
yes, absolutely. But the notion was these were HFCs are industrial gases. It's the
Mm,
kind of thing that Montreal Protocol was set up for. We wanted to get an effort moving there, and we wanted the U.S. and China to bless that. And
mm,
the Chinese were quite antagonistic to it at first, and this was all very, very quick. This came up late, and I negotiated this with another top member on my team, Sue Biniaz. Um, and basically, we were in China anyway for right around the time that the chief of staff of the White House asked me to do this. So I raised it there, and then we had about one. Then went back to Washington. We had about 1 week until the SternㅅLanding meeting was going to happen,
mm,
and so we were on the phone every day negotiating this. And they finally said yes, but their position had been you can't do this unless there's a vote and formal uh, um, blessing provided by the UNFCCC. And of course, that wasn't going to happen. And I said vote, but there isn't a vote because again, you have a consensus
okay.
rule. So anyway, they'll eventually agreed. It was a short statement that was part of the meeting in SternㅅLanding, and that ultimately succeeded in the end. Took a few years. Fast forward to John Kerry's office with the fireplace and his dog.
Don't forget the
uh,
dog. The dog is an
don't
important
forget the dog.
negotiator in the climate protocols as
Exactly.
well.
Exactly. So he called me up in early January to get together and basically to say, what do we do for an encore? Like that was a really
Mm,
good year.
right.
2013 was a good year with China. Now what do we do? So I said, let me talk to my team. We'll be back too soon. And I talked to my team. We had a meeting. in our windowless conference room where we spent all of our time. And Claire Sorowski, who was my chief of staff at the time, was always kicked around various ideas, and Claire took the floor and said, "Well, how about if the two presidents we knew were going to be together in Beijing in November for the APEC meeting, and she said, what if the two presidents jointly agreed and disclosed their country's plans, their emission reduction efforts, what their targets were going to be for the Paris Agreement, which would then be just 1 year away." And I remember thinking, in fact, I was saying right away, I don't think there's any chance that the Chinese would do that, because that would put them like at cross purposes with their strongest allies in India and Brazil and South Africa and whatnot, and many other countries. But almost as soon as I said that, I thought, well, yes, except maybe they might think that there's something quite beneficial for them to do this at the presidential level with respect to the overall relationship, not just climate change. So I thought, I actually think we should try this. Because the other thing is, I thought if we could actually do this, it would be enormously consequential, because what it would mean, in effect, was that the Chinese then needed a good outcome in Paris, not just an outcome that was so-so or even failed, but wasn't their fault. That often was their view, that not that they wanted things to fail, but just as long as they weren't getting blamed, if it was good, if it was medium, if it didn't quite happen, that was okay. This would give the Chinese an imperative to get the thing done, because you would have had their leader walking down the aisle with President Obama in a very high profile way. They would then really need to get a deal done. So I thought it's worth trying this. And Carrie and I went to China then in February. He met with President Xi and all of their top leaders. And I was with him, but he obviously had the lead. And he was, right out of the box, the very first thing he raised with President Xi and talked to him for about 20 minutes was climate change. And the Chinese were on board to try to do this, and we got going. And John Podesta from the White House then became the White House guy who was working on this with me, and Kerry was involved, and Obama was involved, and that it was a 10-month secret negotiation, and secret for a very particular reason, which was that we wanted to do this. We knew that the actual targets for both sides would probably not be ready, just from a matter of internal processes, probably wouldn't be ready until the fall. We couldn't have President Obama walk down the aisle, literally walk down the red carpet in the Great Hall of the People, in effect embracing President Xi, if the Chinese target was weak. So we needed to know what it was before we were like, okay, it's like we're ready for the takeoff. So it had to be secret in that respect, and kind of miraculously, it stayed secret. It didn't leak.
I mean, that situation, that entire process was, in my mind, the foundation of the title of your book, Landing the Paris Agreement. Because without that, it seems that the Paris Agreement would not have happened. And I wonder if that's also your impression, or that's also your understanding. And number two, whether now the end of your book, when I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but the end of the book, of course, is what happened afterwards. So was that the foundation? Did it create the outcome that you had hoped for? But then what happened afterwards?
Okay. So I wouldn't say it, more or less, I agree with you. I never say it quite like that. I wouldn't go quite so far as to say there wouldn't have been a Paris without that. That's possible. I don't, but what I do say is, I think it's the single most important event on the road to Paris that had to do with giving Paris the kind of momentum to get done. Because I think that countries, first of all, the entire world was shocked. The press was shocked. This was front page news everywhere, and
I think a lot
And
of us remember it.
yeah, and countries were shocked, and negotiators and ministers, everybody. And so, the message that it sent, I think, to climate diplomats all over the world, was that this is actually going to get done. I mean,
Mm,
if we have the two 800-pound gorillas, who, by the way, put forward not just what their targets were going to be, but there was a very important joint statement between the two of them that said things like, in effect, I mean, I don't have it in front of me, but in effect, we're going to work together. We're going to work together to resolve any problems. If there's any problems that come up, I mean, it was a statement of the president saying, we're doing this. And
mm,
we're gonna and if there's other kinds of problems somewhere, we're gonna work to get those solved. That was a really, really important statement. And I saw many negotiators, obviously, during the course of the year, but including some who were sort of the most on the other side of the equation from the U.S. To the greatest extent, who felt very confident now, very much more open to the U.S. even
mm.
from that standpoint. So
Now,
it was quite important.
now, before we talk about Paris itself, I would like you to give us a summary for again for those of the readers who like yeah, the Paris Agreement was really important, but actually, what was it? What was included? Tell us the
Yeah.
the key portion, the key moments, not the key moments in the process, but what actually was the outcome? What is the Paris Agreement?
Well, the Paris Agreement involves a bunch of different elements. For starters, there's, I mean, the kind of crucial thing that's always part of these agreements is what does it do with respect to trying to push greater action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And so there was something that people there, and I remember the sort of great leader on of the small and islands and vulnerable countries, Tony DeBroom, used to call it the ambition mechanism, and I think that is embodied in a few ways. Very strong goals that were agreed to. The temperature goal, the literal temperature goal in the Paris Agreement is to hold the increase in global temperature above pre-industrial times to well below 2 degrees, and with, in essence, best efforts to keep it to 1.5. That was very important. There was a somewhat convoluted part of the agreement, article in the agreement that talks about essentially getting to net zero emissions at that time in the second half of the century. That changed a lot afterwards as a result of some science that and reports that we can talk about. But at that point, get to net zero by the second half of the century. Um, it set up two staggered 5-year cycles.
Mhm.
And the first 5-year cycle is for countries to put forward their individual targets for reducing emissions. And each 5-year moment, countries are supposed to put in targets that are stronger than what they had before, and that represented I forget the exact words, but basically their highest possible ambition,
Mm.
consistent with their own level of development. But so words that were very much pushing in a better and better and better, and like as possible and significantly better as quickly as possible. So that was a very important part of the agreement. There was an important part of the agreement that's sort of a cousin to the mitigation side that I was just talking about. Was transparency, and what transparency is the thing that lets everybody in the world, other countries, the press, people interested in climate change, allows everybody to see whether countries are doing what they said they were going to do. So it's quite important. Um, and there was a quite strong article that was agreed to on transparency. There was a huge struggle over uh, an issue which at some level is the undergirding issue all the way back to the beginning on climate change, and that was embodied in the progress of it, I would say, was embodied in what ended up happening in transparency. And that what I'm talking about is the underlying sort of struggle in climate negotiations forever has been between developed and developing countries, and
Right.
with the kind of signature moment at which that kind of became what people literally inside called described as a firewall between developed and
Mm.
developing countries, with all of the obligations uh, assigned to the developed countryside. And it's quite understandable why that happened.
And
And we
where
can go
was
into that.
China?
Oh, very much on the developing countries side. And it's the developing countries not as they evolved, it's the developing countries as they were listed in 1992,
Uh,
period, with no
yeah.
evolution. And believe me, we talked and tried to move in that direction, but
I think we all
absolutely.
know China in 1992 is a very different
Well, exactly.
nation
China,
than China 10 years,
absolutely.
20 years, 30 years later.
Yeah, China in 1992, I don't remember the exact numbers, it was probably half our size, half the
Mm.
size of the United States. And in 2009, even, it was already the biggest emitter in the world.
Mm.
That much bigger in 2015. It's about 30% of emissions now. So it was just
Yeah.
growing astronomically.
So, I mean, this is an interesting question then. Paris Agreement is signed, job done. How's it going?
Okay, so we can skip to the how it's going, but there were a variety of other elements, but uh, and I guess I would just say very quickly, there were a couple of elements that had to do with sort of the structure of the agreement. Some of
Mm.
it was bottom up. Countries could decide on their own emission targets. Part of it was top down. You had rules. Some of those rules were
Mhm.
legally binding, such as the transparency rule that I was
Right.
just starting to talk about. All right, so how are we doing now? Look, I think that it's a mixed bag. I think that the Paris Agreement, in many respects, is doing quite well. We are obviously not where we need to be in terms of reducing emissions. Um, I think that a number of things in connection with Paris. First of all, I think that uh, the reaching of the agreement had a very positive effect all over the world in all sorts of ways that didn't just involve those negotiating, but involved boardrooms and governments
Mm.
and citizens all over the world. And there was a very interesting report I remember done some years ago by a good analytic firm called Systemic. It's based
Yes,
in
of course.
London. And Systemic wrote a piece called The Paris Effect,
Hmm.
maybe 2020 or so, about 5 years after Paris, tracking the just explosion of clean energy research
Mm.
and development and progress that had been made. And look, I think that was starting. That there was some very positive movements before Paris, but again, I think that was sort of like gave it rocket fuel
Mm.
and confidence that the leaders of the world at least had really focused on this issue and were trying to grapple with it, and it had set a an actual agreement in place, which look, we go back to 1995 when the original Granddaddy Treaty, which is the Framework Convention,
Hmm.
is 1992. Within 2 years, the countries of that framework agreement realized there needed to be another kind of agreement, a more operational
Hmm.
one that would tell countries more clearly what they needed to do. And we've been trying to get that done for 20 years. I mean, we, the
Right.
world. I mean, it had
Right.
failed in various times. So now you had a quite good agreement, and an agreement that people on all sides of the aisle, so to speak, in terms of the negotiations, which is to say everybody from the wealthier developed countries to the
Yeah.
poor islands and vulnerables all over, thought this was frankly better. I think Paris ended up better, the actual agreement, better than most everybody's best case scenarios walking in.
Oh,
That's
wow.
definitely true. We didn't think it was going to be. We thought it would happen and would be good. It was better than we thought.
Hmm.
So all right, so but back to how we're doing. So I think that there was this positive knock-on effect in terms of technology. There was an imperative, which is typical for agreements like this. There are almost always more detailed guidelines that have to be done, spelled out, like in
Of
in
course.
in chapter and verse. And that happened. Came to be known as the Paris Rule Book. That happened in 2018, and it happened despite the fact that at that point the U.S. had checked out because
Yes, the elephant in the room, as it were.
yeah, well, yes, exactly, the elephant in the room. So Trump came in, pulled the U.S. Out of Paris in what I describe in the book as a fact-free speech in the Rose Garden, and
Ah,
so that had all happened, and yet the rule book got done. Interestingly, it got done. I would say probably the transparency rule. You could make a very good argument that it was the most important rule in the
hmm.
entire rule book. And the so-called facilitators, which is a word that gets used in these negotiations, where generally two people could be ministers at some levels, or it could be um, the negotiators in some cases. So the two negotiator facilitators for the transparency rule negotiation were a guy from China and a guy from my team in the U.S. who continued doing it all through the years that Trump was there, and the White House didn't stop him, so that was at least good.
That was something that was very impressive to me, the fact that even after the withdrawal of the United States, literally days after it was, if it, after it was signed, um, everyone some kind of muddled along anyway and kind of went ahead, even though,
Hey, no,
despite everything.
that is true.
It's a
I mean,
testimony to the resilience of the agreement. I mean, to the strength of the structure of the agreement.
no, I absolutely agree with that. I think muddling is also the right word because it's not the same as when the no, but it's true. It's not the same as when the U.S. is there, and it's not the same even at bilateral levels. I mean,
Mhm.
if every time that President Xi met with President Obama, he was getting Obama was talking to him about climate change, and that is what
Yeah,
happened. It was
they were
always
getting things done.
and it was always on the agenda. You couldn't like pretend it wasn't there. And
Mm.
if the counterpart to President Xi is Donald Trump, he never has to worry about any pressure from the United States because he's not going to
Mm.
get any. So that kind of thing matters, and not only with China. All right, so uh, other aspects of Paris, I think it continues to monitor and manage aspects of the agreement that are important. So we already talked about the 5-year cycle for individual
Hmm.
countries to re-up. So that's got to be kind of administered. The other cycle is really important. It's called the global stock take. Also every 5 years, a different every 5 years, like I said, staggered.
Ratchet.
Yeah. Well, the ratchet, I would refer to the ratchet as the individual. You're supposed to ratchet up your individual targets, but
Right.
the global stock take is meant to be an examination of how the world is doing in the aggregate, right?
Hmm.
So on reducing emissions and
Right.
in a variety of other ways. And so the first global stock take was held last year. The site of the conference was Dubai from the United Arab Emirates. So that, of course, raises eyebrows, just like your eyebrows just raised, because it's a petro state.
Mm.
Uh, that said, they did a quite good job in a lot of ways, given who they are,
Right.
and the actual text of the global stock take, because you always have to look at like what's the actual language that gets agreed upon. And it's by no means perfect, but there are a number of important elements in it, and the most important of all is a sentence that includes the phrase the pledge to transition away from fossil fuels
Yes.
in a manner consistent with the actual 2050 goal, which again is net zero emissions. That's an extraordinary statement. I mean, that the statement doesn't mean it's going to happen, but it means that remember that consensus rule. That means that
Yeah.
all the countries went along with
Agreed
it,
to that. Yeah.
agreed to it. Now, I will also say when the global stock take was finished and there was a standing ovation in the hall, one nation was glued to their seats, not standing, not applauding, and that was Saudi Arabia, because
Well,
they didn't want that language. And sort of amazingly, that's the first time in all the history of climate negotiations, going back to 1992, that the words fossil fuels had ever been mentioned in a UNFCCC document.
wow.
Um, so that's quite important if that were to actually happen. Look, if you want to step back for a minute at like how are we doing now? Like
Yeah.
how do things look now?
I mean,
I
and
bet
of course we are, days away from a US election, which might impact the situation
yes.
profoundly.
Well, we can
So it's
we can
difficult. I
we,
mean, this is not, you're not Nate Silver, so I won't ask about that prognosis, but
well we can get to that in a minute, but uh no, I'm losing track.
how are we doing now is the ultimate
Yeah,
question.
okay. So right. So when I look at the landscape of climate change now, I kind of look at it in the context of three major factors affecting all this. And the first is that the science, the actual science as reflected in the famous 1.5 report from
Hmm.
2018, other major reports, several other major reports that have happened from the big UN science body known as the IPCC,
Hmm.
looking at the reports, but also just looking out your window, looking at what's happening
Yeah.
actually in the world. What you see is that the science and the impacts are coming at us faster than anybody had predicted,
Mm.
faster than scientists had predicted. It's coming at us harder and faster, and it's serious earlier than this level of seriousness earlier than people had imagined. So that's number one. Number two is progress on the technology side. The green tech side has been nothing short of spectacular. I mean, really
Mm.
spectacular. And that's been true. I mean, that's probably been in play for roughly 10 years or so. But if you look at any of the relevant data on solar, wind, batteries,
Mm.
electric vehicles, electric heat pumps, you'll see the cost curve going like that, if you can see my hand
Right.
moving way down rapidly, and just the reverse in terms of the uptake, how much is coming into the system, which
Hmm.
is like way up.
So we've
And
got the bad
that's
news and the good news.
yeah, so that's super, super important. And if there weren't a third element in my three elements theory, then I would say we would have a decent chance to actually get to something like net zero in something like 2050.
Right. So what
But
is
the
that
third
third
element,
element?
the third element is the obstacles. And the biggest obstacle is the fossil fuel industry, and not just in terms of what they produce, but in terms of their influence around the world
Hmm.
in many countries. And so, I think that's a huge challenge. We'll see. I think it was potentially a profound uh, line that I talked about a little while ago on transitioning away from fossil fuels, but it's not going to be easy to get there, despite the fact that it was agreed to.
Hmm.
Um, I think that there are some things that Paris can do better, the Paris Agreement can do better in its sphere, and there's some things that need to be done better outside of the Paris sphere. To move in the direction that we need to. And it's not obviously not going to be easy to get to those goals, but there wouldn't even be a chance if we weren't making the kind of technology progress that we are. And even in the areas where that where the progress has yet to transform that sector, such as heavy industry,
Right.
steel, cement,
Mm,
aluminum,
mm,
chemicals, etc. But there is such a burgeoning level of innovative activity all over the world in labs, in new startups, et cetera, and all over in China, in the US, and Europe, and et cetera. I think we're going to conquer those things, but some of them will take longer time than others. So, I think that the other thing I think back to something that a very good kind of clean energy blogger named David Roberts wrote, and who he didn't, I mean, he's still around. He was at Vox, and now he's at a place called Volts that he started. But he doesn't usually focus on the negotiations. He's more focused on what's the next technology or how are we
right.
doing on the industry or whatever. But he wrote back in, I don't know if this was 2010 or 11 or 12, but he had covered that COP, and he said that from his point of view, basically, unless you have enough people with enough clout arguing in the right direction, you're not going to
Mm,
get the progress that we need. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. And what that
mhm.
brings us back to is the need, and it's happening already to some extent, but not nearly enough. But the need to have much stronger norms.
Mm,
Uh, Sort of hearts and minds have to get behind this and civil society has done a lot already, but it's got to do more. And in the kind of context that says politicians are not actually immovable, but the way that
yeah.
you move them is that if they think that they are in trouble if they don't do the things that you're talking about, in this case, taking climate change seriously enough and making the progress we need, that's the thing that's going to be bad for their political health, not the opposite. And again, we're a lot further than when I first got pulled into climate change in 1997 from a different job in the White House. It's dramatically that notion of support is has dramatically advanced as compared to where it was, but it's not all the way there yet. But I'll give you one example of the kind of tipping point, socioeconomic tipping point that we kind of need to get to, and that's
What's that?
going all the way back to the original Earth Day in 1970. You guys are Earth.org, so Earth Day should be
That's right.
important.
Yes.
So the original Earth Day came about when Senator Gaylord Nelson from Wisconsin decided that, first of all, there was a kind of a budding environmental consciousness that probably tracked back to Rachel Carson's
67.
1962,
62, right.
book, yeah, 62 books, Silent Spring, and then later in the 60s, there had been an incident which kind of caught people's attention, which was that the Cuyahoga River in Ohio caught
Yes.
on fire, right?
Long
So
Canal, yeah.
yeah, so Senator Nelson thought that maybe he could capitalize on this huge amount of activism around the country among young people and people young at heart, with
Mm,
respect to the Vietnam War and civil rights and women's rights and all of that. It was a time of tremendous both turmoil but also activism. And so he thought we're gonna take a phrase from the 60s. He was going to do a teach-in, and not one teach-in, but there'd be
right.
teach-ins around the country. And on Earth Day, 20 million people showed up.
The
I
first
mean,
Earth
that's
Day in 1970.
the first Earth Day, 20 million people, which is just, I mean, you think about that. It's like quite
Yeah.
astonishing. And within 2 years, you had the Environmental Protection Agency was created, the Clean Water
Mm,
Act was passed, the Clean
mm.
Air Act was passed, and this is all in
So
the administration of the very liberal Richard Nixon.
So we now have
Sure.
a new generation. Your once 4-year-old and 9-year-old who were comparing
Yeah,
your whose
they're
negotiations you were comparing to
they're 19 they're
benefits. Yeah.
19 and 24 now, right?
Are they interested in environmental topics? Are they going
Yeah.
to go forward and become
Oh,
climate
I don't
negotiators
know
like their
that.
dad?
Well, I certainly couldn't speak to that, but they're actually quite focused on climate change and environmental issues, and I think young people certainly more than anybody else are focused, particularly on climate
Mm,
change. I saw just the other day a piece on a study that actually is a few years old. It's from 2021 by the magazine Lancet,
mhm.
and it was a bunch of polling taken around the world and about the level of anxiety and fear
Yeah.
that very young people have when they think
Climate
about climate.
anxiety is a serious issue.
Yeah, and so all of that points in the direction, I think, of the kind of norm shifting that I think is possible, the kind of hearts and minds
Mm,
development that needs to happen. But it's more than it used to be. There are, people coming through the pipeline, so to speak, that are going to carry this further. But it needs to happen more deliberately and more
mhm.
purposefully, in order for us, I think, to make the kind of
Yeah.
progress we need at the same time as there is all of this technology effort going on, and that's going to keep going because that's got its own momentum, which is great. But
Mhm.
you've also got to push back against the
Yeah.
obstacles.
So there's one question I want to ask before we close, since this is for the book review section. What is the book that you would recommend from that shelf behind you that I see in your background? And it's clear that you have a fairly extensive home library or an office library. Is there one that you would recommend to our readers?
One that is relevant. Because I could
I mean, you
recommend
can recommend The Lord
I
of the
could I
Rings if
could
you like, but
recommend I could recommend any of the books by John le
yeah,
Carre,
I,
which
I, I knew it. John
all
le
of which
Carre
I've
and
read.
50 Shades of Grey. That's the other one.
I haven't read that.
Yeah, no, I haven't either. I
Um,
mean, that's what I tell
yeah,
everyone.
yeah. Well, I think that I don't know. Looking at my bookshelf, the original climate change book that I read was a book called Red Sky at Morning, and it's by Gus Speth, who is a
Gus
hero
Beth.
in Gus Speth, Speth. Um, uh, and that was a wonderful book. I mean, it takes you back more than going forward, but that was a very good book. I think that um, there's a book called Collapse by Jared
Jared
Diamond.
Diamond.
Yeah,
Hmm.
he wrote a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel. I
Guns,
think.
Germs, and Steel. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a award winner. This one is about civilizations that have successfully or in more cases unsuccessfully dealt with environmental problems and that have disappeared because they weren't able to either to see them or to manage their own internal politics, if you could
Mhm.
call it that, because these are often ancient civilizations. And with a kind of clear warning
Mhm.
that we may be unbelievably technologically sophisticated, but unless we can get our act together, the technological sophistication doesn't prevent people who are in leadership positions from making decisions that take us in the wrong direction. And um,
The interesting thing about that book to me is that his final chapter was all about China, which at that moment was in a pretty bad state. But if you compare
huh,
China then to China now, very different picture.
absolutely. I mean, China is in many respects the most interesting country in the world on all of
Mm,
this because on the one hand, continue to build coal plants at an unsustainable rate rather than shutting them down. But they are indisputably, without even a close rival, the most important clean energy producer in the world. So they do
Exactly.
both of those.
Mm.
Um,
Well,
so yeah.
I'm realizing that we're just about out of time, and I want to thank
Yep.
you very much for spending this time with us. And absolutely fascinating book. I wish you the greatest success of this, and thank you again to Todd Stern, author of Landing the Paris Agreement.
Thank you very much. And of course, I wouldn't say my book is the most important book to read, but I would be delighted for people to take a look at it because I think it gives them some good instruction about how things work at the international level.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.